Okay, hopefully you're looking at this slide that says outline. We will not go into all of this. This is just my title slide from a um, larger presentation. I wasn't actually positive what Adrian was fully going over. So you've already seen these. What is the Atlas? This is, again, just why we need all of you to know how to do this so we can kind of complete some of our original goals. This is fun to see. This is an older image of that same red-bellied woodpecker map that I showed earlier. So it's fun to see it kind of filling in over the years. You've seen these already, but again, we need all of you to help make this work. So one thing I really want to get across, because we've thrown a lot of information at you already today. You know, this idea that there's you know, these blocks, there's priority blocks, all this kind of different stuff to keep track of. Safe dates, which we might even just skip today. At its most basic, all we need, what we want from you, are these four, arguably five, pieces of information. So date and time, location, where you were, what species, and especially for people who like already are, if you're already using eBird, besides for the Atlas, you know, this tends to be the information that you take down. Anyways, with 3 different Zooms open right now, I got to notice that my internet is unstable. So if I'm breaking up or something, please let me know and I'll try to repeat myself of anything we miss. But even for, you know, non-eBird users, like this is typically, like most birders, this tends to be the kind of thing that you keep track of, you know, whether it's in a notebook. Fantastic. So as I was trying to say, like this is kind of the basis, the basics that most people, you know, even if you don't consider yourself a birder, like tend to kind of collect this information of, you know, where you were, when, and what species you saw. And really the only thing that we need added for this project is this idea of a breeding code. What level of, you know, breeding evidence did you observe? And just to show kind of how this fills in on our map, and a point that I think is helpful, if not really important, to get across is that for this atlas, we're basically just looking at the state of Maine broken up into all these blocks, and we want to know within that block what is the highest level of breeding information. So this map is looking at song sparrows. It's actually an older screenshot, so it's filling in quite nicely. But where you can see those dark blocks that have the confirmed records, you could think of that as done for song sparrows for the rest of the project. Yes, there's great information of knowing, you know, different places and having lots of records. But if you think of it from that perspective of, we just want to know what is the highest level of each species in each block, I think it makes this project seem a little more attainable. And again, we'll talk about those different levels in a little bit. Just to zoom in on this and actually see what's filling in that map. And I can show you how to find this all from the eBird website. But what's filling in that map, making all those blocks the color that they are, is each one of these little pins represents an eBird checklist that was submitted. And wonderful thing about using this database is that it knows where you put that pin. It knows what block you were in just based on your longitude and latitude. So it will populate that block with the highest breeding code. So the key, what we're looking at here is those red pins with the C are the confirmed records. The more purplish with the R are probable, getting down to possible, and then just observed records. And that's, I'll just pick an example here. We'll click on one. This is basically what that checklist looks like. We're going to enter, we're going to do a couple examples that are actually just going to be like a single species. But here, I believe it was Adrian that I was talking about earlier, like you can still submit, yes, and as was posted in there, observed means that the bird was seen, but there were no breeding codes applied. As you see on this list here, we've got the location where they were. eBird automatically assigns the block level. Here's our date and time. This is a nice list because Jeff even put in things like his effort, the amount of time and the distance he traveled. And now we've got this list. You can see there's 18 species on it. And none of these have breeding codes. So you can still include them on your list. They'll just go down as observed. Scrolling down his list a little bit. Here's our song sparrow. That was the map we were looking at before. That's why there was that red confirmed pin on the map. And here he put in the breeding code that it was carrying food and even did a nice job uploading a photo. We don't need photo documentation for the purposes of the Atlas, but it is, it's nice that eBird can host that. For some rare, unusual species, it's especially nice. But a good example of, you know, here's a complete list, all the birds he saw, but at least added this breeding code to that one species we're looking for. And that's what's populating these maps. That's what's filling this all in. It looks like the question, I think, was answered in here, but it's a really good question before we move on too far. The question was about entering the number of species. And for this part of the Atlas, it is not important. As long as we know that that species was, you know, in that block on the date and time and what behavior it was doing. eBird itself loves knowing how many there were, how much effort you put in. But again, just to, you know, my goal is to keep this as simple as possible for us. As long as we know those four things, date and time, location, species, and behavior, that's what we need for the Atlas. As I think Glenn mentioned, if any of this seems intimidating to you, once we start getting into eBird, we have all sorts of different data sheets. Again, any way that you want to get this information to us, we can get it entered into our database. I actually know there's a woman in southern Maine who wrote to us and said they will never leave their house. They're essentially homebound, but love watching the birds in their backyard. And they have a spiral bound notebook that they're going to write down the species, the date, and any breeding behaviors they see, they'll record in that notebook. And then they're going to mail it to us at the end of the Atlas. And some poor intern's going to have to enter it all into eBird for us. But I want to, you know, I think that is just a prime example of, you know, however you want to collect this information, we'll take it. eBird, having you enter your own records will save us a lot of time, but we can make it work for you. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip some examples. We've kind of already looked at maps, except I'll maybe show these last two. So Eastern Phoebe is the map we're looking at here. It's a very easy species to detect because they tend to nest on people's porches, on their you know, underhangs of porches, if not in sheds. They're very vocal. So you can see the map is filling in beautifully. Lots of confirmed records all over the place. There was a good question, the list of these breeding codes. We're going to talk about them all in a second, but they are all listed in the handbook and also on eBird. So when you see, I'll show you both places to find them. So Eastern phoebe, everyone loves, wonderful fly-catching bird that, nests on our porches. Lots of data filling in the maps. Here's rock pigeon. I do need to update this. There have been more records to come in since I took this screenshot, but it's a very funny example of how kind of a bias in observations where people seem to not like putting in the time documenting non-native, arguably invasive species. But it's one of my favorites to start with because they're very easy to observe and do some really funny behaviors. This was actually the first bird that I ever got a confirmed record of for the Atlas. I was at Pine Point looking at, beautiful ducks and things. And sure enough, this rock pigeon started picking up little dead pieces of grass, even carrying little bits of plastic. And it kept going underneath the little walking path there where I was building a nest, right underneath where everyone walks. So even though they are, I know some people call them like flying rats and things, I like using it as an example because it's a nice way to prove that, every bird counts for this atlas. And it's a nice segue into this idea of these breeding codes. If you want to follow along, I can give people a second. So Amy just posted the link to, if you go to maine.gov/bird atlas, you'll see a tab for resources and materials, or Amy put the link right in the chat. And these should be on page 18. Hopefully you can still see my screen as I'm going to maine.gov/bird atlas, resources and materials, volunteer handbooks, and we're just going to scroll down to further down, way down, page 18. Appendix 3, breeding bird codes. So we're gonna look through these. I won't go over every single one because there's actually a really nice written description. And almost anything that you're gonna observe, you can read these descriptions and figure out what it's gonna be. I'll switch back to my slides. And let's talk about some of the, especially the common ones. So as you've seen a few times, there are 3 different tiers of breeding codes: possible, probable, and confirmed. And this will kind of make sense as we go through them. I'm going to start with the possible, and I have a typo in this already because we've actually changed, you'll see in eBird, it is changed so that it's now singing bird, because we actually know that there are a lot of female birds that sing as well. This idea of H, or let's see. Not sure how well you get the audio on that, but here's our song sparrow singing. So singing is behavior that is done to attract a mate or defend territory. So that is a possible breeding code. The next one's a little bit trickier. It was inappropriate habitat. So here we have a male red-winged blackbird sitting up on, on the edge of a cattail marsh, a place that it is very likely, sorry, I see Amy's helping get into the intermediate session. red-winged blackbird in a cattail marsh, that is a likely place that it's going to breed. It really makes you wonder the question, like, when is a bird not in appropriate habitat? And the best example I can think of is, like, imagine, you know, you're driving through a parking lot, and sitting next to a McDonald's, there is a herring gull just standing in the middle of that parking lot. That is arguably not an appropriate breeding habitat. But it makes you wonder, because if that herring gull walks over to, you know, the little grassy median, grabs a mouthful of dead grass, and flies to the top of that flat building, that is a perfect location. And you've actually seen now a confirmed code, a bird carrying nesting material. So these lower codes, possible codes, I would say use with caution. There are a list of safe dates. This will confuse a lot of people, so I'm actually going to gloss over it for now. But know that these lower codes should only be used within the safe dates. You'll find them in the handbook. And again, we really want these lower codes, because there are issues with, like, a red-winged blackbird, even while it's migrating, will sing. So we don't want to be using them, you know, too early in the year. Best example I can think of is, you know, every time we get like a warm day in February, black-capped chickadees start singing in Maine. You hear that wonderful. And those are just very excited. Sorry, you should only be seeing the red-winged blackbird photo right now. I can jump back just if you want to see. These are our two possible codes: singing bird and inappropriate habitat, that should be used within safe dates. But to just finish that black-capped chickadee example, we don't want to be coding black-capped chickadee singing in February as possible breeding, because it's way too early. So safe dates are there to help, but they don't exclude records. The best way I can say it is you should still report what you see. So getting up into this list of probable codes, again, we won't go through every one of these. They are listed in the handbook. But there are some that can cause a little confusion. You've got that song sparrow that you've heard singing once. You know, maybe it's in your backyard, and you start going out, you know, every day you hear that same song sparrow singing, and after a week it's still there, still singing. You can actually bump that up to a probable breeding code. The code is S7 for singing for 7 or more days. The typical follow-up question is, people say, gosh, how do you know that it's the same bird? Especially right now, like, you know, a lot of these birds are still on the move. Use your best judgment is kind of the best way to think of it. You know, you can usually start to tell when territories are really being established. And if you're not sure, it's better to be conservative and not report it. Visiting a probable nest site is another probable code. As you can see, you know, this photo is probably taken a little earlier in the year than this. That's actually the meadow at Gilsland Farm, Maine Audubon's headquarters, in the background. No green grass or anything up yet, but here's actually a pair of bluebirds. They were going around. They both actually went into the box, but came right out and moved on to the next one. So they might not actually use this nest site, but they were showing some, you know, some probability that they were going to. Oh, a fun one right now. This is an American woodcock. Hopefully you can hear that wonderful peent noise that they make. The peent is considered the song of the American woodcock. So if you go out and you hear painting woodcock, you can put that in as the possible code, singing. But if you know American woodcocks, they have a wonderful display that they do. After they paint a bunch of times, they'll take off and they'll fly up fairly high. Might actually be able to hear it in one of the next clips. So the aerial displays they do, they fly up and you can hear this twittering noise, and it's as the wind is kind of passing through their outermost primaries. And that is, again, a display. So there's a code C for courtship display or copulation. If you can see, it's a little hard on the dark screen, but this is kind of the final part of their display where the males will actually hold their wings up and go walking towards the waiting ladies. So courtship display or copulation is a probable code. And it's a fun one to start doing a little research. There are some great resources online. Cornell has a website all about birds that has, you know, interesting descriptions of most of these. So here's our piping plover nesting on Maine's sandy beaches. You can see it's a male on the left doing this behavior called soldiering, where he kind of puffs up his chest, you know, trying to show off to this female who really doesn't care. Most birds, by the time they start building a nest building, you'll see that as a confirmed code. For most birds, that is confirmed. There are a few, like woodpeckers and wrens, that you need to be a little careful of. And that's why you'll see there's a code that's it's wren/woodpecker nest building. And so the best example is this, the house wren in this photo. House wrens, males will show up on territories before the females, and the males will start building what are often called dummy nests. So he will go around, he'll find all the sticks he can and fill them in all the cavities he can find, so that then when a female shows up, she will check all of these potential nests, and then, you know, whichever one she likes most is where they will actually nest. So that's just another one to, you know, be careful of, and make sure that, you know, it's coded correctly. There was a really good question just posted, so I'll pause here to say it. If you see a bird in your backyard, should you record it just once or every day that you see it? The most basic answer I can give, and again, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. So with those 4 things, date and time, location, species, and breeding code. So once you've entered that once, you're good, unless the breeding code changes. So if the breeding code goes from possible to probable, we want to know about that. We want to know about it, you know, if it goes up to a confirmed record, really important. But you don't need to submit, you know, that song sparrow singing every single day in your backyard. And then, you know, as I tried to mention before, think of it from that you know, bird's eye view perspective, sorry, the pun, for that kind of final map that we're looking for, where we want each block filled into kind of its highest breeding code. So once you have confirmed song sparrow in your backyard once, you're done with song sparrows, you know, in that block for the rest of the atlas. As far as we're concerned for our, you know, most basic part of the atlas, there's still great information from you entering it multiple times, multiple days, but that I would call that extra credit. And yes, we'll see in an example when we submit a sample checklist. There's a reason the codes are kind of in the order that they are, but you essentially always want to pick the highest code. So chickadees, kind of like woodpeckers, will excavate their own cavities. It's remarkable to me that with that tiny little beak, they'll make a cavity that they can nest in. it's something like 90+% of all the nests that they start, they will actually nest in. But it is kind of like those wrens, maybe good to be sure that the bird is actually using that as a potential nest site. There's a question about a block that is already adopted. Yeah, great job answering, Amy. But this is one thing that probably one of the most common questions we get, so I'll answer it real quick right now. You'll see that some blocks have been adopted based on where you logged in. If you only use eBird, you'll never see this, so don't worry if this sounds confusing. But one of the ways that you can participate is by adopting a block. And if you look on that map, you might see that like the block you live in has already been adopted by someone. That does not exclude anyone from reporting observations there. So you can report any bird you see anytime, anywhere, and it will help. Don't worry about it if a block says it's already adopted. Let's do these confirmed codes quickly, and then eBird, we'll take nice and slow and make sure everyone's comfortable with it. So now that we're up to these confirmed codes, they kind of make sense. At the top of the list, if you see a nest with young in it, like you can't get any higher than that. That is clearly a confirmed breeding code. Nest with eggs, occupied nest. Now it's interesting, we can kind of see how as we go down this list, you can see where the confidence level kind of goes down a little bit. So recently fledged young, like that's implying that you now have young birds, you know that they were born somewhere nearby, but you're not at the nest anymore. So that again, that kind of confidence level essentially goes down, but it's still a confirmed code. So that's why there is a hierarchy here. And then again, if we go all the way down to something like carrying food, CF, carrying food, that is just an adult bird, flying by with food in its beak. Like it might not even be in the same block where it's actually going to feed its young. So don't dwell on that too much. It's not terribly important. The takeaway is report what you see. Now there's one code I wanted to mention. It's a confirmed code that hopefully most people are not going to ever need to use this, but there's some harsh realities that you should be aware of that it does exist. So in this photo here, it looks like a veery that's being banded. This is a bird banding station in West Falmouth that's run by Biodiversity Research Institute. It's probably where Ed would be right now if we didn't have all these crazy lockdowns going on. But one piece of physiological evidence that you can get if a bird is breeding, females get what's called a brood patch, an exposed part on their stomachs where they're actually going to sit and brood the eggs to keep them warm. And males get a coichal protuberance, which is as gross as it sounds, but it's evidence that the male is trying to breed. So for people, like Ed or other bird banders who are going to be capturing birds in nets and banding them, that's who this code is primarily meant for. But I do want to kind of acknowledge the harsh reality that billions of birds die every year in the US from being killed by cats, feral cats, or owned cats even. And we're in the, hundreds of millions that die by flying into structures, mostly buildings and windows. So we've got 3 years left in this atlas. There is actually really good odds that you are going to encounter a recently deceased bird. And as much as I hate to see it, you can gather a really valuable piece of breeding information by examining that bird. As a real life example, this was last year in June. We were driving around in Rangeley for the Rangeley Birding Festival. Saw this ruffed grouse that had unfortunately been hit by a car. we turned the van around, went back, and sure enough, the bird had a brood patch on it. So this was a female that would have been incubating young. So we're still able to submit that for the Atlas. Kind of a nice way to think that the, this bird even, what's the phrase, post-mortem, could still give us a nice bit of information for the Atlas. So things that you are more likely to see, probably one of the most common codes for a lot of our birds is carrying nesting material. So this is a gray catbird carrying this, pretty long stick. And that's honestly why it's going to be very easy to see. For a lot of birds, they're creating nests that tend to be quite large, carrying these objects that are going to be very easy to see, even just at a quick glimpse. It's not like you need to identify what it's really carrying. As long as you make sure it's nesting material. But that is probably one of the most common codes that I use, especially earlier in the season. Same thing, mourning dove, carrying nesting material. And one of my favorite things of this atlas is that it just, great opportunities to observe some really cool things that birds do. This is a tough photo, but it's a black-throated green warbler. It's actually stripping the bark off this birch to go build its nest with. And a lot of this stuff, we really just need to kind of slow down and watch the birds for a little bit. I see it happen all the time, to pick on the group of birders. Usually the motivation is to go out and see as many species as possible, follow along a whole path or trail and see what you can get. With atlasing, I love to just find essentially a spot in the woods to sit and just watch what the birds are doing around me. This was at Mass Landing in Freeport, and was just doing exactly that. Realized that there was this black-throated green warbler that was singing. The male was singing quite a bit, and then finally caught a glimpse of this one that was gathering nesting material. As we get a little later into the season, certainly by June, a lot of these birds are going to be feeding young that are in their nest. And if you see an adult bird carrying food, CF, that is another confirmed breeding code. There are some exceptions, so especially some raptors, like an osprey is probably the most miscoded bird out there, that if you see, an osprey that's going to catch a fish, pull it out of the water, is going to fly off some distance before it goes and eats that. So that's just, just know that there are some exceptions. It's not necessarily going to feed young, but especially for all of our, songbirds like this is a salt marsh sparrow down in the Scarborough Marsh. Really the only reason you're going to see an adult bird carrying food is if it's going to feed a little baby bird that's stuck in a nest. Otherwise, that's just really kind of a waste of energy for an adult bird. So it makes sense that would be a good confirmed breeding code. Dark-eyed junco. I love this photo just because the biodiversity in this bird's mouth is unbelievable. It's got a little either dragonfly or damselfly. It's got some lepidoptera larvae. It shows kind of the importance that we really need to have, a nice variety of insects on the landscape. These birds aren't feeding their babies, birdseed. If food goes in one end, fecal sacs come out the other. So this is another nice way. If you see, a bird continually going into a bush, maybe you can't see that it's carrying food in or anything, but most birds are going to try to keep their nests quite tidy, at least especially through some adult birds will ingest fecal sacs in the first few days of the chicks hatching out. Then they're going to spend most of the time carrying those fecal sacs away, keeping the nest clean. It's going to help keep predator detection down. Maybe towards the end of nesting, I'm sure we've all seen some pretty gross nests out there. But this photo is actually I found this song sparrow that was diving into this rose bush. As I said, you know, with my example before, like I never saw it carrying in any food. I assumed it was breeding, but almost every time it flew out, it had this little white fecal sac. You could think of it as like a little diaper that the baby birds excrete in. It was carrying it off and always going to the same perch. So you're actually looking at 3 different fecal sacs that the song sparrow was just dropping there. So, and perhaps it's a good point to make here. Well, I did say there was a hierarchy to those codes. As soon as you get into, you know, that category, especially confirmed codes, we don't want you necessarily going higher, especially if it's, you know, going to cause any disturbance to a bird. So as soon as you see a song sparrow carrying food, you're done. You've confirmed that song sparrow, that's fine. I know at the top of the list was that nest with young, but we don't want volunteers, you know, crashing through the foliage, cutting back branches, you know, just to try and find that nest with young in it. The category's there in case you happen to find it, but again, we're not encouraging people to disturb birds.
Sorry to interrupt, but people are asking about dates. I think there's a little confusion on when to start. And
yeah,
you might want to talk a little bit about the safety.
okay. Let me show, I think I just have like just a couple more examples, and then we'll look at safe dates. And I think especially when we do an example submitting a list, that might help kind of clear it up. But thank you very much. So, you know, a bird at a nest, that was a red-eyed vireo. Here's northern Parula building. They're awesome. They use the usnea, that lichen to make this little almost tennis ball-like nest inside of there. There's a code called occupied nest. It's a little hard to see in this photo, but on that kind of near branch, this is a blue-gray gnatcatcher. You can see the tail just barely sticking out there. And, you know, so here was a nest. I love it. You can see the lichens that it's actually pulled off the tree and put around the nest to help camouflage it. So this is one that there's this good category of occupied nest where you might look at it and you say like, oh gosh, I can't tell if there's eggs, if there's young, but that bird is just sitting on it. So implies a confirmed code, occupied nest, which can help for some species. One species that this code could be used with that would be much easier to get confirmed records are chimney swifts. If people ever see like chimney swifts in the summertime, you know, they'll often fly down people's chimneys. And again, we don't want people, you know, climbing up on their roofs, looking down their chimneys with flashlights to see if there's any birds breeding in there. But that's why this code exists, is that if you've got, you know, using that example, that chimney swift is flying down the chimney during the nesting season, it can be implied that it's probably going to a nest in there. And you can use the code occupied nest. Nest with young. Sometimes you can't see the young. This is yellow-bellied sapsucker. The chicks were in there making a ton of noise the entire time I was trying to camp. As they get bigger, it's a lot easier to confirm that there's young in there. This tree swallow almost taking the head off the adult. And then the last code that I want to kind of emphasize here, I think it was mentioned before, recently fledged young, implies that they are young birds that are still dependent on the adults. So we've got 2 immature song sparrows here, 2 juveniles that are begging the adult for food. So still dependent on the adult. And a very common trait that you see is that they're really incapable of sustained flight. So you'll often see this like, you know, walking through the woods or something, you accidentally, you know, you flush this little baby bird and it just hops 3 feet, you know, tries to flutter, but essentially, you know, runs off in the foliage. Like that would be recently fledged. The big problem we're seeing is that people are finding, you know, birds that they can identify as a juvenile. You know, it was born that summer, but no longer, you know, relying on the adults, and honestly could have flown hundreds of miles to get to the point that it was now. So very likely that it's outside of the block that it actually was breeding in. A good hint is that tail feathers, those nice long tail feathers in most cases, tend to be one of the last feather groups to grow in on a juvenile bird. So I usually, you know, if you're having trouble judging, you know, you can tell it's a young bird, but all the feathers are fully formed, probably better to not use recently fledged. But usually if I can still see that the tail is a little short, I'll still code it as recently fledged. Same thing, Louisiana water thrush. Oh, this, I guess I like this example because the juvenile on the right, it's here begging for food from the adult. But when I first saw it, it looked like an adult. It had a full set of adult looking feathers. Tail was fully grown in. Like visually, I never would have known. Maybe there were some hints, but probably wouldn't have assumed that this was a juvenile until seeing it beg for food like that. So those are the examples I wanted to give. Again, we didn't go over all of the codes. I'm going to just rearrange my screen a little bit. Hopefully everyone's looking at, I still have the handbook open with the breeding codes on them. One thing that I think will really help kind of answer some of the questions, especially around the dates of when to report these things. The most simple answer I'll give right away is report anything you see anywhere, anytime. As you know, if it's a bird doing a breeding behavior, we want to know about it. So to get these handbooks, we had a lot printed for our in-person event. I would say write to either, well, Glenn Middlehauser, if you email, I think Amy gave it above, but it's Maine Bird Atlas at gmail.com. Glenn will definitely send, can mail anyone hard copies of it. It's available as a PDF on the website. So yeah, we can get copies to you. Otherwise, it is available on here. If we didn't have social distancing guidelines, I'd have other ways to get it to you, but I think mailing from Glenn is probably the easiest way. So what I want everyone to see in the handbook here, looking on page 20, are these safe dates. And remember I said that the safe dates should really apply to all of the possible codes. There are a couple probable, but let's just keep it simple and say all of the possible codes you should only use within these safe dates. So I want to just show, let's just use an example. So American Robin, it says that its safe dates are from May 10th to August 1st. I have seen many nesting robins before May 10th, especially if you live in southern Maine. You could probably step outside right now and find robins gathering nesting material. Probably a little early for young, but an important thing to think of is that these are kind of statewide. A birder in Aroostook County, Bill Sheehan, our regional coordinator, actually sent me a photo of him out birding this morning, and there was still at least a foot of snow on the ground where he was. Those robins are probably not breeding yet. It's likely that some are still migrating. And that's really the point of these safe dates, is that it's saying for each one of these species, this is the date range that we know that they should be breeding statewide. So for those lower codes, like the possible singing, that's where you should be careful. Don't report a singing robin until May 10th. Or that low code of inappropriate habitat. As I said, robins are still migrating, so we don't want to say that they're inappropriate habitat if they're just moving through. That said, all of the other codes, these higher probable, all of the confirmed codes, supersede safe dates. So when you see that, you know, robin, here's our example, you know, carrying nesting material on April 25th, that's where you can report that bird despite the safe dates. You know, we still want that information. And safe dates, I know, are very confusing in that way, especially given that we have, you know, 250 species on here. The thing that I'll tell you, and maybe, you know, should be a little conservative saying this, is I would rather have you report the bird and, you know, accidentally report it outside of the safe dates than have you not report it because you weren't sure what the safe dates were, if that makes sense. The best way I can say it is we can always filter this on the back end. So if you know, report a singing American robin on April 25th, 16 days before the safe dates, it's not bad. It's a little bit more work for us, but again, I would rather you put that record in than you know, not submit it for some reason. So that might have been a long way to kind of say that answer of, you know, you can start atlasing right now. I've been submitting breeding records for weeks. There are a lot of species that are, you know, still migrants haven't even shown up yet. We've got lots of warblers that are still going to show up, especially if we kind of look down this list a little bit, like, you know, magnolia warbler, they're not even in Maine yet. So June 1st is their safe date. We want all those migrants to go through in May before you start, you know, using at least those lower codes, the possible codes. Mourning doves, people have already found fledged young this year. It was actually before the safe dates that people were finding young. Because we're also having a fairly early spring, which I would say is an important takeaway in all of this. These dates are out there, but okay, I see the question. This took me a little longer than I had wanted to. Let's submit a checklist. And hopefully this will kind of clear up some, well, clear up questions about how or where to submit. So just for kicks, I'm going to, oh, sorry, I can't type and talk. I'm going to go to maine.gov/bird atlas, because that is the home page for the atlas. It's where you can kind of find anything. I think Glenn mentioned, you know, it's safe to, you know, once you found these, you can bookmark them so you can, you know, access if you know where you're going to. But maine.gov/bird atlas will always kind of get you back to a good starting place. Again, the resources and materials is where a lot of this stuff exists, but we want to submit data. So here's a nice tab for that. When we click on this, you'll see think both Glenn and Adrian showed this at one point. The important takeaway is that if you're submitting a checklist that has at least one breeding code on it, you want it to go into the Maine Bird Atlas portal. This is where eBird starts getting a little confusing. I know portals were mentioned before. The best analogy again is like, if eBird is a giant house, the portals are the different rooms in the house, and we want breeding information to go into our room. If it doesn't have a breeding code on it, you can use any other portal, and I'll show you how to change these portals later. Again, kind of like my earlier statement about the safe dates example, if you submit checklists to the wrong portal, we can still access that data. We can filter that data. It's just, it's more work, and if everything goes into the breeding portal that has breeding information, it actually tells us kind of a much more complete picture. For the sake of keeping that kind of simple, I'm biting my tongue a little bit. So anyways, let's just imagine as I'm sitting here, I'll make up an example that I'm sitting here, I look out my window and I can see a tufted titmouse carrying nesting material. So I want to go on to ebird.org/atlasme to submit that. And there's a nice link right here. So maybe a quick answer, if you've already used eBird, if you've submitted a record with a breeding code on it, you'll actually get an email from Glenn. He sends them out once or twice a year, where he combs through all of the checklists that go into eBird, and will send you an email with this long list of however many checklists you've submitted, and you can click on each one and actually then change which portal they go into. So if you're saying, oh my God, I've submitted all these checklists, how will I ever find them and be able to switch them? You'll probably hear from Glenn about it at some point. So for the sake of time and doing this example, let's just look at how you could do this from now on. I'm going to do this checklist on the web. I'll do one on the phone. And I'm going to maybe stop looking at questions because they distract me way too much. But we'll do these real quick and just see how this goes. So Maine Bird Atlas, you can always check which portal you're in the top left corner. There is, as you can see on this page, no breeding codes. Go to the Maine eBird portal. Because sometimes you'll find yourself in eBird and it's almost like you're stuck in a portal. So we've created this link. If you click on it, notice it gets you out of the Maine Bird Atlas portal. You can always just go to ebird.org to get to regular eBird. Or, say you're in the main portal and you have breeding behavior you want to submit. It's kind of a nice loop that's been set up. So always look in that top left corner to know which portal you're in. We'll click on submit. So you can choose from your locations. As you start using eBird, it will start keeping track of all of the many places that you've ever submitted a list from. If you're new to it or going to a new place, we really recommend using this Find It on a Map tool. As it says here, you can either enter in a block. If you know it, all the blocks have a unique name. I don't know a single block's name, or I can't identify one. They're all kind of funny names, but you can enter in a county or the entire state of Maine. This will make sense in a second. So I live in Cumberland County, and so you can see Cumberland listed here. And actually all these ones under it, Cumberland Center, CE is central east, central west, northeast, northwest. So these are actually all blocks, and the naming scheme, they kind of come in groups of 6 based on, kind of their orientation. But let's just click on that county level, Cumberland County, and you'll see why. We'll just jump to that. Because now it's kind of it almost seems like an unnecessary step to me, but I don't run the database. So eBird, once you get to this map, you can now search it. It's just like Google Maps. You can type in any place name, address. So if there's, Maine Audubon's Gilsland, Gilsland Farm. Well, I guess it just comes up to Gilsland Farm Road. But you can start finding these, locations in a much easier, kind of more precise way. The reason we really encourage people to use this map view before you, click to put a dot where you are birding is that this map view, as I zoom back out, you'll see it shows us the block boundaries. So this pink line is showing a priority block. These other white lines are, zoom out so it's a little easier to see. These are all of our 9 square mile blocks. And actually, Gilsland Farm is a really good example of one of the problems here. This is all, the whole sanctuary. But notice how the North Meadow falls in one block and the West Meadow falls in a different block. So for the purpose of the atlas, we really want to make sure that you're reporting what birds you see in the correct block. Unlike, birding, when I go out just trying to make a list, we used to do walks here every Thursday. We just do a list for all the birds that we see at Gilsland Farm. But for the atlas, we really want people to make sure that you are reporting birds breeding within the correct block. Yeah, I hope that's clear. And that's why using this map view is really important. So let's just say, oh, it was up on the North Meadow. Click your pin to, be as precise as you can. At least make sure it's in the correct block. You can switch over to a satellite view and say, oh yeah, it was in like that third tree, 1, 2, 3, like great. Name it whatever you want. We really don't care about the, I can literally just click, don't even need to double click. Just a single click will drop a pin. We'll do this on the phone next because it's a little different. Name it anything you want, Doug's favorite tree. We don't care what you name it because we're essentially just getting the longitude, latitude from this. I need to delete this later, so if I put stars at the top of it, it'll put it at the top of my list. It's a good trick for any people who use eBird a lot, especially submitting from the web. If you put an asterisk at the beginning, it'll put it at the top of your drop-down list. So continue. Let's just say it was today. Remember, we're now getting into, our 4 bits of information. Where were you? When? So date and time. We'll just say it was today. So there are different ways to submit your observations. The one that I want us to at least walk away today feeling comfortable to do is this incidental observation. And as defined here, birding was not your primary purpose. So a good takeaway is that eBird is a database for birders who are going to a location, putting in a certain amount of effort, and keeping a list of all the birds they see. That's great. For the atlas, all we care about is what bird you saw, when and where. and the breeding location. What am I forgetting? So an incidental observation works fine. If you were keeping track of everything and including your effort, you can use the stationary if you've just been staying in one place or traveling. Notice how there are new fields of information that are needed. But for our purpose today, let's just say an incidental observation. It was at 7 a.m. this morning. Party size was just me. Not necessary for this field, but or for incidental, but it's good information to know. You can add comments, anything that you want to do. We'll click continue. And now eBird, because it knows where we were and when, it'll give us this list of all the species that are possible, likely to have been there at that time. It's a long list, so I would recommend just using this jump to a species. And the nice thing is that as you start typing in a species name, it'll appear here. So we'll just click on that tufted titmouse. It'll bring us right down. Type 1. Add breeding code or details. And now here is where we add our breeding information, that fourth piece that we need to know. And this list should look somewhat familiar to you. So we're starting with our possible codes, going up to our probable codes, probable, and then confirmed. You might notice there's one more code on here that's flyover, which is more for eBird's purpose so that people can report a bird that's not actually using the habitat. Don't worry about it from the perspective of the atlas. Just know that it's in there, I guess. So we were saying that we saw this titmouse carrying nesting material, which is CN. And now we can go down to submit. There is this question, are you submitting a complete checklist of the birds you were able to identify? Because we did an incidental checklist, it is by default no. This tends to throw people off for some reason. So the example that I'll give you is that if you go to the beach to look at shorebirds and you report a list of the 5 different species of shorebirds you saw, and you look through your list and you say like, oh man, gulls, herring gull, great blackback gull, like, I'm not even going to include them on the list. I know they were there, but I'm not going to include them. That's where you would otherwise say no. If it is every bird that you yourself were able to identify, you would click yes. Yeah, it looks like it was answered there, but I'll just try to illustrate. So if you're trying to enter a species that's not on this list, there is this add species button. That is almost scary because it will let you add anything in the world. Stygian owls, which will never ever show up in Maine. It's going to freeze my browser now. If it starts working again, the other kind of nicer way to see it. Oh no. Let's see if I can stop this. This is interesting. The other good option, yeah, Stygian owl will be found in Deering Oaks in Portland after this. This is going to make it a lot harder to do this if this freezes. Okay, so there's our Stygian owl where you could report it. Notice that when you do report something rare that you've had to add to the list, it does get flagged and it will require that you enter notes. So a good one to be aware of. I lost my toolbar. The other thing I wanted to show, I clicked on the side here, so it said show rarities, and that just adds to this list other rare birds that have been seen in Maine before. It would be the same thing that if you tried, I lost my buttons. If you tried adding a rare species, it would still ask you for more information. But anyways, that's how you would add a species that's not there. It's a little safer to use this show rarities than add a species. So submit. Now that my browser is hopefully working. And there we have it. There's our date and time, our location. It automatically puts the block in for us. There's our species, and now our confirmed code. That's as simple as it is. We had a couple bumps on the road to submitting this, but you know, that is a perfect record for the Bird Atlas. Let's just say that this titmouse didn't have any breeding code. I've submitted this checklist and I'm looking at it and I say, I've got, you know, these bits of information, but no breeding code on it. We don't want it in the Maine Bird Atlas. The quickest way to change this, and I know this was posted before, this button over here that says checklist tools. You click on that and go down. You've maybe even looked at this before, but had no idea what I was talking about. Change portal. We click on that. You'll now get this drop down that shows you all the different portals in the world. And it's actually fun to see. You can see some of the other breeding Atlas portals. So New York is launching one, Maryland and DC. Israel's doing a breeding bird atlas. Remember, for our purpose, you know, we care about Maine, we care about breeding records. If you're submitting a checklist that doesn't have a breeding code on it, I don't care which code, which portal you put it in. We'll put it in eBird Peru, which in a second here, this should update. You'll see, yeah, you know, it's still, going back to our analogy, it's still one big house. These are different rooms in the house. But eBird Peru, you know, all it'll do is you know, maybe change my default language or something. So the point is, put your breeding records into the breeding portal. Otherwise, they can go just about anywhere. It's 4:12, so I know, you know, we're past our currently allotted time. I want to show an eBird checklist from my phone real quick. I'll remind people that this is being recorded, and it'll be available to watch later. So let me do one real quick, but if people need to run, I understand. And maybe, you know, post in the chat right now if you feel, you know, relatively comfortable submitting a checklist. And certainly next Wednesday, 6:30 p.m., I will be in Zoom to answer all these questions. Wow, perfect timing, Amy. All right, let me share This will be seamless, I'm sure. Nothing else has gone wrong today. Of course it's struggling. Let me try this one more time. Oh, hopefully you're all looking at my phone right now. So there is an eBird app, a free download. I should have mentioned this before. eBird is, again, run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. If you don't already have an account, there's actually good odds that you do. If you've taken part in any of their projects, whether it's Project Feeder Watch, the Great Backyard Bird Count, or any other Cornell project, like Yard Map was a popular one a couple years ago, you can use the same login that you had for those projects. You can use that to log into eBird. So I'm going to launch the app. An important thing, as we've seen that there are different portals, when you launch the app, in the bottom right-hand corner, it's hard to follow along, so I'll try to orient you because we don't have a cursor or anything, but in the bottom right corner where it says more, ... we tap on that and then go to settings and account near the bottom. That's where you can log in, change your settings, and notice all the way at the bottom is portal. And here's that same list of all the different portals around the world. There is our Maine Bird Atlas. So select that. Back to settings, done. And, you know, I guess I should mention, you know, be cautious with that because now every checklist you submit from your phone is going into the portal. So what I usually do is I won't switch it over until kind of mid to late May. That way, you know, as I'm doing all my birding all over the state, I can still submit my checklist to eBird, but I'm not flooding the breeding portal with all of my non-breeding checklists. As I say that, I'll also say, you know, we'd rather you get the data into us, so don't let that, you know, stop you. Before I go any further here, actually, and I'll just show, you know, when it launches again, you can get to the screen by clicking on more. And if it's your first time using the eBird app, you'll notice at the top, it'll probably prompt you when you first download the app, but where it says packs, you tap on that, it'll find your location, and it will, on this nearby tab, it'll recommend, you know, based on where you are, that you should have this downloaded pack. And what that does is essentially stores on your phone information about what birds are likely to be around you. So a very common thing with atlasing, especially in the northern part of the state, is that you are likely to not have cellular service. This will allow you to still essentially use all of eBird's functions, even if you don't have any data connectivity. So let's submit our checklist. That's at least got you in the right spot. So when you first open the app, you're already going to be on this submit screen. The app is not as great for entering kind of historic or older records, but you can see that if you tap on the date, you can go back in time. You know, if you say, oh, I forgot to submit that bird that I saw a couple days ago. It's really good for just submitting what you see, you know, currently. Again, we'll just do it kind of an incidental observation here to make it easy. So I'm just going to say start checklist. Your phone knows where you are. Even if you don't have cellular service, the phone can still connect to GPS satellites. So it will automatically, as you can see at the top of the screen, in very small font, it says auto selected 43.73292, you know, minus 70.41689. That is exactly where I'm sitting right now. And that's kind of why it makes the eBird app so great for us submitting bird records. It's going to put that bird right where you saw it. So I'm going to tap in the search bar again, and notice the format here where it shows the little, the pound sign number. So number and then species name / code. So I'll type in 1. Again, it's going to filter right down. When it says code, it means there are 4-letter codes for every species name. So tufted titmouse is TUTI. That's what it means by code. I find it a little confusing when we spend so much time talking about breeding codes. But there's our tufted titmouse. Just tap on it. It automatically enters what you had just typed in there. So there's our 1 tufted titmouse. Tap on tufted titmouse again. And just like you saw where we could add details on the web version, here's this breeding code that we'll click on. Now, this is the one thing that drives me nuts about eBird. Here's our same list of breeding codes, but notice it's flipped. It's upside down compared to how it is on the web. So on the web, we said pick the highest code on the list based on how it was structured. This is, you know, with those are possible codes at the top, probable, and confirmed at the bottom. Why, I wonder. Anyways, it's just kind of, it's there, it's you know, just important to know, but as long as you're always reporting what you're seeing, you're safe. So our example is carrying nesting material. You can just tap on done. And then it's really nice because it didn't used to do this, but you can actually see on the right-hand side of that same column with tufted titmouse, it now shows the breeding code, CN. A question came in the other day that I just think is really important. I think we've said it today, but you know, imagine you're walking and you run into one tufted titmouse that's singing. Then you walk a little further and you find a pair of tufted titmouse that seem like they're in good habitat, which is, you know, up to a probable code. And then you find, you know, a 4th and a 5th that aren't doing anything. And then you find a 6th tufted titmouse that is carrying nesting material. So that's where, like, you do need to make sure that you're only reporting the highest breeding code that you saw of that collective group. Again, we don't care that there was a titmouse singing if there was one carrying nesting material. Hopefully that's clear. So down at the bottom, we can click stop. Now, a nice thing about the app is that it will track where you go. So you can actually, like, see in the top left, it started a little timer when I started this 4 minutes ago. It thinks that I've traveled 5/100ths of a mile despite just sitting in one spot. But if you've, you know, traveled on a long loop or something, it's kind of a nice way to see, especially to make sure that you haven't crossed boundary lines. So we'll say stop track. I notice almost all of our information is here, except it says choose a location. We'll tap on that. So by default, you can just immediately, you know, in the bottom right corner say, yes, use this location. It's this, I guess it plotted me at 1 Winslow Drive. I live at 3 Winslow Drive. You can see further on the list. But that's fine. It's within 0 feet away, it says. So it's very accurate. Just like we did on the web, I always encourage people to tap on the map and then maybe zoom out a little bit. And again, now that we're in the Atlas portal, you'll see there are our block boundaries. So always good to kind of review and make sure that your checklist, that you didn't accidentally wander into a different block. You can actually see this map before you even started walking around. Let me just go back into it. So imagine we were on the screen, we were actively birding, walking. You can just click where it says, or tap where it says auto selected. And that brings up this same screen and allows you to see the map view. So as Lex asked in the chat, if you wander into a different block, should you submit 2 lists? Yes. Ideally, for the purpose of the Atlas, we want to make sure that if you're submitting a breeding code, that it's within the block that it was observed. So we can I will try to wrap this one up. Use this location. I'll just click review. So we can see we've got our date and time, our location, our species, and then the breeding code CN right next to it. Is this a complete checklist? No. Actually, stationary is listed there, right above observers, below the location. We can just change this to incidental. So that's what we're focused on today. And then click submit. And you're ready to submit the next bird you see. Just wanted to see if I could find an example. I submitted this one outside of the portal. All right, that's I'll avoid going down a rabbit hole there. It's 4:26. I'm going to stop sharing that screen. Maybe even put my face back on the screen. So, what a day it's been. Yeah, as Amy just said, thank you everyone for participating, for especially dealing with some of our technical issues here. Follow us on Facebook. That's probably one of the best ways to learn about some of the other events that we have going on. It's both on there, and then on the maine.gov/Bird Atlas page, you can find a calendar, which is a nice kind of Google listing of Google calendars that we'll have all of those events and the links to like the Q&A sessions that we'll also be holding. See, Adrienne made it back into this group, so I just trying to give her privileges to speak. Yeah, again, feel free to email us with any questions. We'll have certainly many more opportunities to get any help that you need.